be here a little later on. But I'm going to take the time at the front because, oh, he's back already. But I wanted to introduce a few people here that are with us today in addition to residents. And then sitting in the front row, we've got, first of all, the new chair, right? Lutheran Towers, okay? We got Kevin, and we got Marty rather. We got our own beloved Sue Campus, and then we have Frank from Legacy Point. Frank, all right. Now, some of you don't know that we've recently put together a pretty strong team for FLiCRA. So as I've called their names when they stand up, we got them gathered over here. So focus on that side of the room. Scott Purcell. Stand up, Scotty. Hold your applause. We'll be here all day. Steve. Roger Beverly. Roger. Lloyd Yeager. Betty Roncevall. Steve Cassetta. Ron Kenny. Don Eskin. And Blair, and your speaker yesterday, remember? Yeah. Bob Stahl. Bill Stahl. Bill, pardon me. And Ann Blair. Okay. Now, as I told you, this is a treat today, and you didn't come to hear me, so I'm going to go quickly. But I am going to introduce who I think is everybody in this room's best friend. One of the people in Tallahassee who's really on your side. I've known Bennett for a number of years. He's been the director of FLiCRA since 1992. He said he's just turned up the 34th anniversary, so it means he's in his 35th year, which is the note I had down. He's a certified association executive, and that's a wonderful professional organization of people like Bennett who run organizations like this for advocacy for special interest groups. Bennett brings deep expertise in policy, leadership, and organizational strategy. He's got a Master of Science degree from FSU. How many FSU people we got here? Hey, yay. Okay. He's completed a lot of additional work and certifications on special subjects. Public policy, intelligence, national security, to name a few. Bennett's been named one of Florida's top 500 most influential business leaders by Florida Trend magazine for the last 8 years. Most recently, he's completed a little bit of certificate work. But what I want to tell you about Bennett will take about just a minute. And I've had the opportunity, in fact, the excellent opportunity to work with Bennett closely over this last year. And I can tell you that he is a real advocate, a professional advocate who gets things done for you residents. And I'm so happy to welcome him here today. He's a close personal friend in my view. And Bennett, I'll give you the microphone. Let's welcome him.
Turn off your phones. Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Voice okay? Is that mic close enough? Okay. Just grateful to be here. It's been a few years since I've been here. I got to do a tour this morning of the new health center and memory care and assisted living, which is beautiful. Believe it or not, it's been a while since I've been here, but I've been here, I think, probably about 25 times, believe it or not, over the years. And I was sharing with your local leadership here. Over the years, we've had a number of residents from this community that were on our state board of directors. And very intricate members, and so I'm just grateful for the rejuvenation here and all your efforts. And Basil, I'll talk about specifically in a moment and give the compliment back to him because he's been a great advocate for you as well and subject matter expert over the last 7 months, specifically for what we're getting ready to talk about. So, everybody familiar with the Irish goodbye? No? Irish goodbye means like you sneak out. But I'm not going to sneak out because you would all see that. But the legislature is in Tallahassee as we speak, and specifically on what we're going to talk about the next little bit. There's a special meeting on continuing care legislation at 2 o'clock. So I'll try to somewhat around 2:15 range, hopefully get moved out and then get on a phone call and be on a speakerphone with some of the stakeholders, which I'll share who they are in a moment. But I'm just grateful to be here with you, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. So, I'll stay here as long as we need to make sure everybody comes away with an informed decision and more information. Just a couple of things. Some of these things I'm going to go fairly quickly so we can talk about like what's happening today or what have you done for me lately. But this is the continuing care retirement community map of the state of Florida. You can see it broken down by county, and you can see kind of where the pockets are: Pinellas, Hillsborough, Palm Beach, Broward, certainly then Fort Myers. So you can see where the concentrations are. So the biggest thing is, I shared at a lunch meeting just a minute ago, about every 3 to 4 years, we've got one new CCRC opening. UCF Legacy Point was one of the most recent ones that, but you're not new anymore. There's some couple that come behind you, and then in any given year, we have probably 10 to 12 of the CCRCs in the state are expanding the number of living units. And so the population continues to grow because of that. One in particular, Atlantic Beach area, there's a CCRC now opening a second CCRC. They haven't even broke ground yet, and it's 100% sold out. And again, I was talking to some of your leadership this morning. We've got entrance fees, depending on where you are in the state. You've still got some, maybe in the $250,000 entrance fee. And then I go into Naples, not so much. They have now some of their communities that they're opening are close to $3 million entrance fees. So you've got a little bit of everything in the supply chain, if you will, for residents. On the political side, the biggest thing I would say is every county that you see in white, that means there's no continuing care retirement community. So legislators in Tallahassee, if they don't literally have one in their political district, their first inclination is that you're a nursing home, which that's not what you are. But if they don't know and don't have familiarity with it, you kind of have to educate them, what continuing care model looks like. So this is what we're going to kind of cover, but I'm going to focus primarily on what's happening right now, literally, as we speak. But you need to have some background and context for kind of how things work and what the process is and things like that. A quick commercial, because we've got 3 CCRCs represented here today. Any of you can do this, but if you go to our website, which is FLiCRA.com, on the website there's an education tab. And so through the efforts of a volunteer task force, and we've got 2 more of these coming, these are educational modules about continuing care in Florida, specifically for, not limited to, but specifically focused on people who are on a resident council or somebody who's newly elected to a resident council to kind of familiarize themselves with the law as it relates to resident councils and the roles of the council. And it's broken up into different sections. They're all YouTube videos, so it takes you directly to a YouTube video. And especially the intro for new residents that have just moved into a CCRC, it's a great, hopefully they understand some of it because they signed the contract. But even I've seen people who don't read their contract, that's a different issue. But these modules are there for you as an educational resource. These numbers change, but it gives you perspective. It's actually gone up a little bit based on the last couple of weeks. Florida is one of the states where you have to register to be a lobbyist. Technically, all of you in this audience are a lobbyist. Now you probably say, well, I'm not, I'm retired. But you are a citizen lobbyist. The difference is, although there may be some of you, you're not getting paid, quote unquote, to represent somebody or, your own interest, if you will. But you are, in effect, a grassroots lobbyist in that sense. But in Florida, as in a number of states require this, you have to register. Who are you representing? How much, who's paying who, how much? And the point of the matter is, you can do the math, but there are what we call more in-house lobbyists that work with one group, and then you have contract lobbyists, which is kind of more the norm. You'll have some lobbyists and or lobbying firms that represent more than 100 different special interest groups, whether that's associations or corporations or all of the above. So it's a fairly, I think, in terms of the transparency around the system, you can tell kind of who's representing who and those types of things. But there's 160 legislators, 120 House members, and 40 state senators. There's way more lobbyists than legislators. So, depending on what time of day you're in the Capitol, the line out the door, the next lobbyist is coming in, literally, and trying to get their two-minute, pitch, if you will. So FLiCRA is your voice in Tallahassee as a resident perspective. And so when there is a need to do so, we definitely have residents that come to Tallahassee to testify or present to committees or meet with legislators. But certainly a lot of it happens at the grassroots level as well. Your staff, myself, and others are located in Tallahassee. But just give you a perspective on FLiCRA, 99% of our revenue is membership dues. That's our only source of income. So, we've got, depending on what year it is, we have, as you know, in continuing care, we have an attrition rate with continuing care population that we have no control over. So, depending on some years we have net gains, sometimes we have net loss, and then you see that every day in your communities. But my point is, membership is the only revenue that we have to help fund our mission in Tallahassee, which is to represent your interest. So, Basil shared, I've been with the organization a long time. So when I first started with FLiCRA, it was all volunteer driven. So from 1989 to 92, for some history, it was literally those founders who founded the organization and built it up, just literally driving across the state of Florida to visit other communities. At that point in time, when I first started with FLiCRA in my role, they had got it up to 1,000 residents already. And then we were able to grow from there. So kind of the biggest thing we're talking about today is resident engagement in the political process, but you have to know kind of the puzzle pieces. So you are citizen lobbyist, your input, your paying attention to what's going on in Tallahassee is extremely important, and then when and if necessary, registering in on what's happening, whether it's by phone calls to a legislator, emails, letter writing is probably not necessary anymore just because it takes too long, so it's more about emails. Every legislator has a laptop at their desk in the Senate and House gallery, so emails is what clearly we use for communication purposes now, and but we use every tool we can as a citizens kind of consumer interest group to focus on your mission. So this is kind of frames what we focus on as FLiCRA. And I was talking at the lunch meeting, you've got a lot of groups in elder affairs like AARP, for example, very broad in terms of what they look at. This is our laundry list, if you will, of specifically what FLiCRA focuses on, which basically touches anything in the continuing care campus that impacts you as a resident directly is what we're going to be focused on. And the goal, hopefully, that something that's getting proposed is beneficial for you as opposed to detrimental. That's the key. The other thing I'll share with you is in a normal legislative session, we'll have 1,800 bills between the House and Senate. And right now, just looking at that list I shared with you earlier, we have 80 bills approximately that we're tracking or monitoring, because a bill that's filed today could look really good, and tomorrow maybe there's an amendment filed to it and changes the whole trajectory of whether that's a good bill or a bad bill. So it's, to be frank, for us, we don't take positions on many bills because it's a moving target in some cases, but also, for us as a kind of from one of our credibility components is FLiCRA, when we take positions on a bill, which is rare, the legislators understand, like when FLiCRA takes a position, it's a big deal, because there are some groups that take a position on everything under the sun. That's not us, although we could. But these are kind of our guiding principles of where we would take a position specifically, meaning your state board of directors will make a policy decision to say, yes, we're going to take a position on this, for or against, or no position, if you will, in some cases. And that's kind of how we guide our efforts. So this gives you kind of the puzzle piece in Tallahassee. So where do we fit in? We're the only consumer group, certainly for continuing care, and quite frankly, in the whole kind of long-term care arena, FLiCRA is the only consumer-specific group where the members of the organization are literally the consumers. And so I'm going to primarily focus on leading age. It's now Leading Age Southeast. And then you got the regulators and legislators. I'm going to talk about at least 3 of them today, 3 meaning including us. So Leading Age Southeast, it's now a 4-state organization, all the way to Mississippi. And you can see that this is primarily the owner-operators of Village on the Green, Legacy Point, Lutheran Towers belong to Leading Age. And that group is not limited to continuing care retirement communities. They have HUD housing for the elderly that belong to that association as well. But they're effectively the only, or at least the primary group in Tallahassee that represents continuing care owner-operators. Some continuing care retirement communities also belong to 1 or 2 of the assisted living associations in Florida, and or the Florida Healthcare Association, which represents the nursing home lobby in Florida. And so 85% of the licensed nursing homes in Florida, including those at CCRCs, belong to the Florida Healthcare Association. So just they're kind of, I call that a 100-pound gorilla, at least on nursing home issues. But Leading Age is who we work with predominantly, and I'll share with you just from a background standpoint. It's not the first time in history, but it's at least the last recent history. We have had a joint work group with Leading Age that started last June. It's technically still ongoing, but we kind of completed our work per se, at least at the research and development component, at the end of December. Basil, as he mentioned earlier, he was on that work group as one of the residents. We had 5 residents, and we've had 5 owner-operators, and then plus staff at the respective associations tackling what's important, and I'm going to get to that shortly. But we had over 8 meetings of the joint body during that 7-month period, and then internally each group respectively had interim meetings in between as we talked about issues and met common ground or had to do more research. We would do that in addition to those joint meetings and then come back as a group. So effectively we went through kind of like day 1 in June, started with a kind of a blank slate. To some extent, we knew kind of what we wanted to focus on, but we didn't have words on paper per se. And so by the time we got to December, we were about version 13, we call it 13.6. So yeah, we had a lot of revisions and adds and some scraps as we went through that 7-month process. So the other big stakeholder, kind of the 3-legged stool for continuing care, is Office of Insurance Regulation. And they regulate your communities and effectively your owner-operators who run these communities and regulate it as a specialty insurance product. So at this stage, just as we speak, some of you that are getting our newsletters saw one I sent out this morning. The legislature, we're in week 2 of the legislature. The continuing care legislation in 2025, meaning in the spring of 2025, there was a bill filed. It was challenging to say the least. It actually did get passed out of one Senate committee, never got heard in the House, and that was that. And then an outcome was the creation of this joint work group with Leading Age during the summer and fall. So quickly after the new year, the Office of Insurance Regulation, Leading Age, and FLiCRA have had a series of meetings with a House sponsor, Representative Allison Tant from Tallahassee, and then on the Senate side, it's Senator Garcia from Miami. The House is taking the lead on this package. So where we are today in terms of the process is that FLiCRA and Leading Age put together 13.6, I just call it that as a number version, about 52 pages of proposed changes to the continuing care regulation in Florida. That was submitted to all parties. The Office of Insurance Regulation, on their own accord, effectively released a draft in October, and then they released a revised version December 19th, and then they released another version in their own perspective Wednesday night of this week. A number of the things in 13.6 are in the current version of amendments, if you will, but not everything that FLiCRA and Leading Age had put on the table. They've added some things and they left some things off, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. But so we're working through kind of the gaps, if you will. But what I can share on the good news side is that FLiCRA and Leading Age, both boards of directors, signed off on 52 pages of agreed upon language, which that in and of itself is a feat. And so we're trying to push as much as possible for, from a legislative process standpoint, to take what FLiCRA Leading Age came up with as the starting point, and if there's other things that can or should be added that can be agreed upon, do that. But if you've got the residents and the providers saying, we agree on these words on paper, let's start with what we can get through, and then add to it. So we have, like I said, we've got a meeting at 2 o'clock today. The House, technically the House bill has 2 committees that it has to go through. The Senate has 3. And really only 2 of the 3 committees in the Senate are what we call technical or substantive committees. The other one's called Senate Rules Committee, but if it gets to the Senate Rules Committee, that's basically a formality. That's the last stop before it goes to the Senate floor. So it's not like it usually gets held up there if it gets to that level. So let me go through some of the things that are going to be, are in the package. And I'll just leave this on the slides, for reference. So let me hit high level. I'm not going to hit 52 pages of changes in this amount of time. You've got some of you have a bit access to a few handouts that Basil's put forth, but I'm going to hit the hot buttons here that I think are most important in the big scheme of things, that especially things that are not in the law today that we're trying to get in the law. One is creating a lien against assets, whether that's real estate or other assets. If a community goes south, whether that's becomes insolvent or bankruptcy, liquidation, if you will, especially depending on what kind of contract you had with refundable entrance fees and or future service obligations that you paid for, that there's a lien against assets to help cover those claims. It doesn't exist in Florida law today. It does exist in Texas and other states. So we looked at other states that have had a long history with this type of approach that didn't affect the market, meaning it didn't, impact financing of communities, those types of things, but also protects resident investments. So that is in the package right now. So that OIR, FLiCRA, and Leading Age have all agreed to that. So that is in there, and that's something that we brought forward as FLiCRA. The Commissioner of Insurance also got behind that lien concept last spring. So, he was supported from the very beginning of that concept. We changed the wording to be more close to Texas law because it's proven. But other than that, that's right now, that's in there. The other big areas that I think are important, because you've got some resident council leaders here, is, how the structure of continuing care retirement communities, it continues to evolve, and more and more the communities, especially in Florida, not nationwide be the same, are part of what we would call an obligated group, meaning you've got a multi-facility, you're part of a multi-facility network, nonprofit or for-profit. You've got a centralized home office, if you will, and then there's kind of this hub and spoke, if you will, and more and more CCRCs are falling into that type of model. And sometimes you've got third-party management companies, sometimes you've got affiliated management companies or hybrids, so it's a little bit of everything. So our goal is, regardless of the structure, when you've got a resident council or a designated resident representative that's nominated and elected by a council, regardless of the structure of that governing board, whoever has decision-making authority to make changes in your fees or services, who are you accountable to, or who, in terms of the designated resident representative, what access do they have to the right people at the right time to provide resident input and perspective as decisions are being considered? So that's a big area, and that topic covers effectively probably 5 or 6 different sections of the law. Everything from definitions to references to management companies and management contracts, especially if it's an affiliated management contract. I was sharing earlier today at lunch, there's some communities in Florida, I'm not saying it's good or bad, you've got the governing board of the provider, and then you have an affiliated management company, and it's the exact same people. So they're getting paid, in some cases a W-2 from more than one entity, and it's all about the transparency, being access to information, that kind of thing. The other area for us that's important for you is disclosure. If there's been a bankruptcy in your community, meaning a new resident moving in, that there's disclosure about that and the history of that, and then also disclosure if the community is part of an obligated group. Because sometimes people wouldn't even think to ask that, or what does that mean? It can be a good thing, it can be not so good a thing, depending on what happens. The biggest thing I always stress in terms of obligated groups, especially for Florida, if you've got more than one facility in Florida, you got one in Tampa and one in Vero Beach or one in Orlando or all between, and somebody's got a hurricane and you needed to move residents from one community to another, you can do that in an obligated group, most cases, in some way, shape, or form, that they can short-term, in some cases long-term, go to another community in that network, and there's a system for that to happen. So that's one of the kind of what I call positive aspects of obligated group. But you can also have, when major liabilities occur within the group, or in some cases outside the group, that may come back where there's assessments to the other members, that residents obviously will end up paying those fees regarding what happened, that there's disclosure that, that could happen, and that's transparent about that. The other thing kind of interconnected with this, related to the liens, is there's a section of law called preferred claims for residents, especially for what's called, in this case, not bankruptcy, but state receivership, or what's called administrative supervision, which can occur in Florida, where the state temporarily would come in to take a community over to get it back into hopefully more corrective action, where it's going to be in a good financial stability. But what we want to make sure is residents, if you look at the ladder of creditors, that residents, because you are outside of banks and the bondholders, you are what funds the day-to-day, and you know that. So we've gotten agreement, again, from FLiCRA, Leading Age, and OIR on changes to that, with the preferred claim section for some proposed changes in that sense. The biggest things that are kind of outstanding, and I'm just going to hit the biggest, there's a few more. FLiCRA and Leading Age are proposing changes to the Governor's Continuing Care Advisory Council, which the Office of Insurance Regulation has used that body over the course of time to be subject matter experts, kind of third-party subject matter experts. When a community is having financial trouble, that group can be relied upon to give perspective, input, guidance, whatever it may be. In the 90s, it was used very heavily by the Commissioner of Insurance and commissioners of insurance in the past. Not so much in the last 10 years. So we're trying to push and advocate for that because we think it's good for the market and good for residents. And so that's something that right now is under the review by the Governor's Office to see where that might land, but that's something we as FLiCRA Leading Age have advocated for in our joint work product. One thing that Office of Insurance Regulation that's put on the table, which is not new, is some way to restrict, quote unquote, an owner-operator from soliciting effectively loans from residents to fund day-to-day operations. There's not technically a restriction in the law on that today. It doesn't happen, but it has happened. Meaning it's not customary, but it has happened. And I'm not talking about contributions that you would make to foundations or employee scholarship funds, gift funds. That's not what we're talking about. We're literally talking about you're providing a loan, quote unquote, to keep the lights on. That's totally different scenario. So OIR wants to put some teeth around that to say that's not allowed and it's criminal to do that. You're not a bank, quote unquote, at least in the true sense. So that's one of those kind of sticking points that's out there today that we're still trying to work through. That's I think relevant for you to be aware of. And so, like I said, sometime this afternoon we're going to kind of know how things look, and it really comes down to, to be blunt, the Office of Insurance Regulation is the regulatory body, leading age is the owner-operator, and then there's you. And you're the ones that live here 24/7, this is your home, and we're trying to make sure, can we get something done that all parties agree to that moves the ball forward for resident protection and also strengthens the market, meaning the model of continuing care, and makes it even more attractive to a new resident that would be moving into this model. That's the goal, or should be the goal. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get something, but it's got an hour at the negotiation stage. And so hopefully we'll the list of what I call outstanding issues is fairly small, but they're still there. So we're working through that. I share the process at this stage is, FLiCRA, leading age, and OIR. It's very open dialogue between all parties. And everybody's listening to each other, which is good, hearing each other's perspectives. And at the end of the day, though, everybody has to agree on the policy outcomes. And so that's where we are. So, hopefully, come late today, feel good about where things are headed. I will share this. I'm extremely happy with the House sponsor. She's from Tallahassee. She's a veteran of the process. And so she knows kind of how to bring groups together and find consensus or find common ground. So if anybody can do it in the legislature, it's going to be her. And I share this with you because somebody asked earlier about did legislators listen to residents. Many continuing care retirement communities are voting precincts in and of their own accord. So that alone in a lot of the communities, legislators definitely know continuing care communities, because if you can say, if I do well, I've got 300, 400, 500 residents that are going to vote my way, that's pretty important. And so, she is in that perspective in Tallahassee. She represents residents in more than one county because of how her district's laid out, but she has 700 continuing care retirement community residents just from one community in her backyard. That's 700 of you, if you will, and growing. That community continues to grow. So she gets it, and she's trying to hopefully bridge the gap, if you will, and get everybody to move something that creates a positive outcome, and that's what we're trying to do. So I will continue to keep you abreast. Obviously, as things go. The legislature, technically, the regular legislative session is 60 days. We're in week 2 of a 60-day session. You've already seen some perspective that there's probably going to be a special session on property tax reform, possibly. And then you obviously have a big election year, at least from a state standpoint, in the fall. So there's a lot of time left, but in some cases I would say not so much time. So we're trying to work through, and even when you get agreement, to get a bill passed within 60 days is never easy, because you've got to get through committee, and there's 1,800 other bills trying to also get heard in the committee and get to the floor. So our goal is get everybody to reach agreement on what we can agree to, and then get the ball moving so that there's time, quote unquote, to get to the floor and not run out of time. So we'll continue to share as much real-time information, and if there is a need, depending on what happens today, for grassroots engagement for residents to contact your own legislators or specific members of a specific committee, we'll definitely put those calls to action out yet. It's premature to do that now because we don't know what the ask is yet. You know, at this we kind of know, but we want to have like everybody is in lockstep on this is the package. Get this bill heard in committee and get it out the door. And so that's kind of what we're waiting to make sure when and if we get you involved at the grassroots level that it's clear what we're asking and what we want them to do. So that I'm going to turn it over for Q&A. You've got I think a couple mics out there, so let's open it up for some Q&A and try to cover the high level aspects of what's being proposed so far, but we could get into the nuts and bolts of it for sure. Steve, wait for the mic.
Can you hear me?
They want to be able to hear you because they're recording.
Bennett, the OIR is the state of Florida's operation that's supposed to be looking out for us. And under 651, there's certain rules that operators are supposed to meet. If they don't meet those rules, and the OIR takes no action, is there a backup?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the question. Yeah, the answer to the question is there are tools that the Office of Insurance Regulation has, especially if, and I'll give you a little bit of perspective on current law. Back in 2019, there were changes to the law, which FLiCRA and Leading Age worked on at that stage together. And you got three what we call regulatory triggers, is what I call them. Days cash on hand, occupancy level, and debt service ratio. If a community is below two of those three at the same time, then that means probably something bad is something's going poorly. So they have additional regulatory action that they can take in those particular situations. But then you've got, the full spectrum where some communities are doing very well and there are some communities, believe it or not, that have no debt, meaning licensed CCRCs in Florida that have no debt whatsoever. Some of them have 100% occupancy and 5-year waiting list. That's not the norm, but they're there. And so there's a little bit of everything in between. So in this package, there are some additional things that would give OIR some additional tools. But for FLiCRA Leading Age, that's also one of the reasons we've put forth this Continuing Care Advisory Council to kind of get that rejuvenated. Because, I've been working with FLiCRA 34 years. In the 90s, I can remember at least 4 CCRCs in the 90s that came before that council. And they're public meetings, so I was in those meetings. That were going towards not a great outcome, meaning they were on the path. If something didn't change, would they have gone bankruptcy or whatever? And not any of those 4 ended up in that outcome. And so my point is that council can be used to help people make the right decisions given the situation. So that to us, that's an important tool that only assists the regulator that we'd like to see kind of rekindled. But there are a couple other things in this package, if you will, that would give the department more. I'll use this as an example with management companies and things of that nature, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, where if Office of Insurance Regulation deems that they have the management contract already, that's a public record. But if they perceive based on market trends that the management fees being charged are exorbitant and at a detriment to the residents, that it gives them additional ability to look at those documents and make changes, if you will, with that structure. So that's a new piece that's in the package right now, which Leading Age has agreed to. So that's an example of something that we're trying to give them some additional tools where it's appropriate.
I was thinking more of something like just audited financial statements.
Yeah, well, I mean, effectively at this stage, in terms of the access to the audited financial statements, there are some components in the package that are being addressed on, some citations, financial penalties for non-compliance, which typically the regulators haven't liked to do that because you ultimately, as residents, will pay that bill. but at the same token, you know, they want to say, I've got the teeth to get this filed in the right form and on time, so that we can do our job to assess what's going on. Because if we can't see the data, we have no way to, you know if things are going well or not well. And so, you know, that's all they can do is rely on the data that they have. And so there are some penalties that are being, you know, proposed there. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, you answered part of my question. Now I'd like to know, how would you evaluate the performance of the OIR and enforcing?
Yeah, I'd say this, what I'll say is this. I mean, I've been doing it 34 years, so the Office of Insurance Regulation has always been the regulatory body for continuing care in Florida. That hasn't changed. The biggest changes that have occurred over time is, in the past, the Commissioner of Insurance was an elected position, meaning they were a member of the Florida Cabinet. Now the Commissioner of Insurance is an appointed position. They are hired and fired, quote unquote, by the Cabinet, which is the Governor, the CFO, Attorney General, and Agriculture Commission. And so, you know, what I can share over the last 3 to 4 years, coming out of COVID, obviously take COVID aside, because, you know, that we know they couldn't go on site even if they wanted to, in some cases, to do on-site exams. But they have, at the legislative level, they have increased funding for the number of staff that are in the continuing care retirement community regulatory division. So they've expanded the number of what they call financial examiners that are looking at the CCRC financials. They've brought on additional actuaries into that unit, and, you know, broadened the staff in that unit, because, you know, they understand they want to make sure that they have not only the right people, but enough people to be looking at what's happening and occurring, and then when they do, especially when they have corrective action issues, that they've got the horsepower to help with those corrective actions. So, you know, I'm not smart enough not to give them on a point scale, but I mean, I will say this, because somebody asked at lunch, you know, the Commissioner of Insurance and his staff are extremely consumer focused. I mean, they've been out publicly speaking at CCRCs since last spring, and the commissioner, you know, his biggest mantra, and he did this in legislative testimony last year: promise made, promise kept. That's what he cares about. Like, you've signed a contract with a significant amount of your funds, and that they want to make sure that your contracts are met in good times and bad times. So, you know, I mean, in that sense, like, from a approach standpoint, they're laser focused on what's important, meaning you as the residents, you're why the regulation exists in the first place, is to protect your investment and your quality of life. So they're laser focused on that. Yeah. Other questions? I know I threw a lot at you, but happy to take any questions. Yeah. Anything that was unclear? Yes, you got a question? Yeah.
I'm just curious about the comment you made about the lady that represents 700 people.
Yes. 700 continuing care residents in her political district.
Okay. How do you count those members? Are we talking everybody that lives there?
Yes.
Or are we talking about those who contribute towards our monthly?
Yeah, so the way I'm defining it, at least in this sense, I don't know if that's the speaker there, is the contract population, meaning people who are on a life care contract in that campus. So if you're asking, like, am I putting in the mix somebody who's, you know, just there for short-term rehab, private pay, I'm not, quote unquote, putting them in the mix. I'm talking about life care, people who are on a life care, continuing care contract. That's you know, effectively that's who this regulation is focused on, because you have the contract, and it's regulated as a specialty insurance product. So those 700 people that I'm talking about in that particular campus are life care contract holders. Does that help?
And members of.
Well, they don't. FLiCRA is a voluntary membership organization. So there's no mandate for residents to belong to FLiCRA. There's no mandate for owner-operators to belong to Leading Age Florida, Leading Age Southeast either. The majority do, but not all. So, depending on what community we're talking about, we have some communities where FLiCRA is basically 98% of the residents belong to FLiCRA. We have some that it's 20% for a variety of reasons, but FLiCRA is a voluntary membership organization. Yes?
I want to take exception to your map.
Yes, but-
Seminole County is not colored in.
Yeah.
And it's not listed anywhere. And
Yeah.
where's Village on the Green?
Yeah.
Seminole County.
Yeah, well, this case I can pick on the Office of Insurance Regulation because this is their map. So I don't know. We'll have to get that fixed. Yeah. So you see it. No, you see it. Yeah, it's here on the left. So you see Legacy Point and Village on the Green. Seminole. It's just in white. Meaning the lettering isn't. Yeah, it's right above Sarasota. Yeah. Yeah, it's there. It's just the font, the color they used in the map. You can't see it, but it's there. Yeah, you're there. Yeah, you do exist because you're right here. I can see both of you right here. But no, you're there. So. Yes, sir.
Is there any discussion or any issue being raised about review of the annual increases in accord with the CPI?
Yeah, the only thing I can speak to that is a couple of things from a historical standpoint. The statewide average, probably for the last 20 years, has been around 3 to 3.5%. The statewide average. Coming out of COVID, there was 1 year where it was north of 5, meaning the statewide average of maintenance fee increases was above 5. Y'all, meaning a Village on the Green, you've been on the high side.
Much higher.
Yes, and within the package that is in writing today, what we've tried to put forth, and Basil was one of the great proponents and advocates on this, is when you have a designated resident representative that's nominated and elected by the council to represent you, when changes of fees or services are being proposed, that there's a longer time frame for them to be involved in that process, as opposed to like, surprise, here's your number, and you can't do anything about it. So there's that process that's kind of built in with some proposed changes. And again, I'm not going to tell you something that is not going to happen. You're probably not going to see in Florida a cap on fees. It's not going to happen. Not in this state. From a business standpoint, they're not going to build in an arbitrary cap on fees. But what you can build in is better transparency of what do the fees need to be, what's causing the fee increases, and is it a one-off, or is it consistent over time that it's outside the norm? And so that's there's some mechanisms built into this package to address that, but there's not a proposed cap on fees.
This may be a curveball, Bennett, but one of the things we haven't developed a good paper for anybody to consider on yet, but one of the major causes for increase is the movement of the industry from the cost-based increases that are in most of our contracts and most of the 651 processes. And right now, I would say that most residents here we had a base increase of 3.5% this year, but most of us are paying a lot more than that. Could you give us some coaching on how that might be resurrected within the bureaucracy to get to adjudication on that?
Yeah, I guess from a general standpoint, aside from, like I said, that there's not going to be a cap, that within the process for the Office of Insurance Regulation, the Office of Insurance Regulation is the body that reviews the contracts. Effectively, they have to approve the language that addresses how fees change over time and what goes into that. So don't want to confuse matters, but there is a parallel process happening with all regulatory agencies right now related to what's called administrative rules. So you've got the law, and then you've got administrative rules that help the regulatory body implement the law. So OIR on that particular topic is trying to look at, are there administrative rule changes they can make on how those clauses and contracts are looked at, and where they might be able to maybe, I would say, push back, but modify that occurrence, in the marketplace. And so that's one avenue that they're exploring that I know.
Any comment on the change of your rates due to the term market rate?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what Basil
That's
was.
basically
yeah.
what he said, but
Correct.
it wasn't that clear.
Right, yeah, I mean, I know I hate to say this, within your network, to my knowledge, you're within your network, and I say Village on the Green, not Legacy and Luther Towers, you're the only one that I've seen in terms of contract language and process that have had that process. I mean, yours is a unique process. It's not the norm in Florida. And so the only way to one way to look at that or rectify that is how the contract approval process, how OIR looks at those clauses in the contracts, and address it at that level. The only other thing that they're looking at goes to the management company side, and when you've got, a home office and this fee over here, and then you've got the site operations expenses, that there's more ability for OIR to look at those other areas to see if it's above market rates to the detriment of the resident population. So that's in the package that's on the table now.
What's a call to action that we can do to make the insurance commissioner take notice of these kinds of things that are happening and enforce the rules that exist?
I would say start small first. But I've talked to Basil about this, especially now because there's a hyper focus. I would give just say for all three of the CCRCs that are here, invite the commissioner or the deputy commissioner of insurance to speak to your residents in person or by Zoom or both. I would start with that so that they understand specifically what's important to your community and your resident population, because every CCRC's got a little different nuance. But I would start with that. At the regulatory level, because you talked about OIR specifically, aside from that, I would encourage you, and if you want to come to Tallahassee, it's 4 hours from here, but we coordinate in-person meetings with their staff at OIR so that you can have a sit-down face-to-face with them in their building. I'd be happy to coordinate that if there was a small group. Don't say bring 100, but 4 or 5 key people from your community, especially your resident council or finance committee folks. We can coordinate that so you get some face time, and they're open to meet, and they usually bring in 10 to 12 of their staff to that one meeting, so they can cover all the bases and answer any questions you have specifically for what's happening in your community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Steve.
Bennett, are there any states that do have a cap on fees? Or is there any states that put a cap on executive compensation?
Not to my knowledge. No.
We're told that if we run out of money, we won't be asked to leave. Are we protected should the company go bankrupt or be sold?
It's two different scenarios per se. So the benevolent fund is kind of what you're talking about, which most communities have some type of benevolent fund. If you outlive your assets at no fault of your own, that they will take care of you. And so every community has a benevolent fund of some nature that's funded to provide that, in that sense. In the context of a bankruptcy, that's where I talked about at the beginning. And right now, OIR, Leading Age, and FLiCRA all have agreed to creating a lien on assets, so that lien is there to cover those losses. And in the case of a bankruptcy. That doesn't exist in Florida today. You have reserves, you have statutory reserves in Florida for both renewal and replacement reserves and what they call minimum liquid reserve, but that's not going to cover a total loss. So that's where this lien would come in to help cover that. Other questions? Good questions. Okay, yeah. I hope you learned something today. I'm grateful for the turnout and appreciate Basil and your team here having me today. And the timing was good. We looked about doing this in November, but actually, being in January, you have more knowledge than I would have been able to tell you in November, just because things have moved down the track a little bit further. So thank you for being here, and thanks for your engagement. Thank you.